thank you so much. Before I get started, just a second, everybody say hi, because there's so many of my friends and heroes are in this room, and I'm just honored. Thank you for coming. So yes, this is a paper that was co-authored with Jacobus Erasmus. He's my colleague from South Africa, so he couldn't make it. But we're going to be interacting with John Schellenberg's argument that he calls the Hiddenness argument. And I've found that this seems to be what most people today are considering to be the greatest objection raised against the knowledge of God, as Paul would say. And so, as Paul would say in 2 Corinthians 10:5, we ought to destroy it. And but with that said, I want to say that John Schellenberg is a fantastic author and writer. I really enjoyed reading his book. And just to let you know what people think of it, Michael Shermer on the back of the book says, of all the arguments for and against God's existence, and I've heard them all, this is the most powerful I have encountered in support of the atheist position, a tour de force. And so that does seem to be the thought on social media as well when I talk to my atheist or agnostic friends, that they do think that Schellenberg has nailed, put the final nail in the coffin, so to speak. So let's talk about that. Why would God, a maximally great being, if he exists, not make his existence clearer or more evident to us? Why is God seemingly hidden from us, at least to some degree? This is the so-called problem of divine hiddenness. Broadly speaking, the problem includes two distinct issues. The first is the theological problem about whether there is a theological reason for God's hiddenness for both believers and non-believers. This problem is not an argument against theism, but rather it's a theological puzzle, so to speak, similar to the issue of how to reconcile God's sovereignty with human responsibility. Well, the second issue is the philosophical problem about whether divine hiddenness is evidence against theism. And John Schellenberg is one of the influential philosophers who argues the affirmative, i.e., divine hiddenness is evidence against theism. More precisely, according to Schellenberg's well-known hiddenness argument, God's existence entails that there would never be any non-resistant non-believers. However, there are some non-resistant non-believers, therefore, God does not exist. In this paper, we offer a Molinist response or solution to Schellenberg's hiddenness argument. The paper is organized as follows. We first briefly explain Molinism. Then we describe Schellenberg's hiddenness argument, and finally, we argue that Molinism undercuts the view that God will ensure that there will never be non-resistant non-believers. Molinism is a theological view named after Luis de Molina that explains God's sovereignty in terms of omnipotence and omniscience. According to Molinism, God created a world containing libertarian freedom, and thus some creatures' actions are not causally determined by external factors. However, since God is free in a libertarian sense, he could have created or actualized any other feasible world, or even refrained from creating any world at all, where a feasible world is a possible world that is logically consistent with the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. Moreover, Molinism says God, having middle knowledge, knows everything that would happen, including any free actions in any feasible world, if he were to create it. God's middle knowledge is situated between, in the logically or explanatory sense, his natural knowledge, his knowledge of everything that could be or of all the logically possible situations, and his free knowledge, his knowledge of everything that will and will not happen after creating some world. Accordingly, middle knowledge is knowledge of what libertarian free creatures would freely do in any circumstances they may find themselves in. So, loosely speaking, Molinism views omniscience as including knowledge of all that could happen, all that will happen, and all that would have happened in the various feasible states of affairs. Molinism, although not necessarily a soteriological model, is a good middle ground between Calvinism and Arminianism because, as with Calvinism, Molinism affirms a sense of predestination and God's sovereignty. And as with Arminianism, Molinism affirms humans have libertarian freedom and are thus responsible, in a desert sense, for their moral actions. Now, we will not defend Molinism here, but rather we will assume it's a sound theological position. I wrote an entire book arguing for the soundness of Molinism if you'd like to see that. And we believe, however, that our approach helps one solve the problem of divine hiddenness. So let's now look at Schellenberg's argument. Schellenberg's hiddenness argument may be stated broadly as follows. Premise 1. If God exists, there will never be any non-resistant non-believers. Premise 2. There are some non-resistant non-believers. Conclusion. Therefore, God does not exist. The key terms are the following. First, by God, Schellenberg means the generic theistic God, and his arguments target many monotheistic views, including Christianity. However, since we are writing from a Christian Molinist perspective, we will understand God to mean the Christian God, the maximally great being. Second, the phrase non-believer denotes a finite or non-divine person, whether or not they are human, who, one, is capable of having a relationship with God, if God exists, but two, is in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. Third, by resistant non-believer, Schellenberg means a non-believer who freely and resistantly deceives themselves on whether God exists and in turn falls into agnosticism or atheism. Conversely, by non-resistant non-believer, Schellenberg means a non-believer whose non-belief did not arise from any resistance toward God on their part. For example, certain non-resistant non-believers are, quote, people who have looked at all the relevant evidence they could find, perhaps even lived it in the case of experiential evidence, but who do not believe. That is, they either are in doubt about whether there is a God or they disbelieve, end quote. Hence, a non-resistant non-believer is a finite person who believes that God does not exist or doubts that God exists because of intellectual reasons or having never considered the matter of God's existence, and not because of emotional reasons. Such a person is not emotionally opposed to the idea of God, and they do not dislike or loathe the idea that God exists. Some non-resistant non-believers might even wish that God is real, but they either have intellectual doubts about God's existence or they are intellectually convinced that God does not exist. This kind of non-believer, then, might have intellectual reasons or disinclination toward belief in God, but they do not have emotional resistance toward belief in God. They are a non-resistant non-believer. Consequently, the first premise of the hiddenness argument states that if an omnibenevolent God exists, there will never be any finite persons who, one, are capable of having a relationship with God, two, either doubt that God exists or believe that God does not exist, three, are not in a relationship with God, and four, are non-resistant toward God. But why does Schellenberg affirm this first premise? First, Schellenberg argues that a person must believe that God exists in order to be in a personal relationship with God. According to Schellenberg, this seems evident enough. Surely one cannot be in a personal or conscious or reciprocal relationship with another party without believing the party exists. Next, Schellenberg argues that the following principle, which he calls not open, is obviously true. Quote, necessarily, if a person A, without having brought about this condition through resistance of personal relationship with a person B, is at some time in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that B exists, where B, at that time knows this and could ensure that A's non-belief is at that time changed to belief, then it is not the case that B is open at the time in question to having a personal relationship with A, end quote. Consequently, to be open to having a personal relationship with someone is to be not closed to the relationship in terms of not open. Accordingly, God's all-loving nature implies that God would always be open to a relationship with any non-resistant seeker. That is, in a non-resistant, finite person who is trying to be and capable of being in a relationship with God. God would not prevent or make it impossible for a non-resistant seeker to participate in a relationship with Him. And God would reveal Himself in some way to the person to ensure they believe He exists. Therefore, if God exists, there will never be any non-resistant non-believers. Well, what about premise 2? Are there some non-resistant non-believers? Why does Schellenberg affirm this premise? Unfortunately, he doesn't seem to offer much in support of the premise because it's an, quote, evident empirical fact, end quote. Indeed, the premise is obvious, he says, because the category of non-resistant non-believer is very broad. It includes reflective doubters and those who have not yet thought about God from both past and present. Therefore, Schellenberg affirms the second premise. Let me add a footnote. Although some people have never thought about God, infants, for example, it's plausible that a non-believer might mistakenly think they are non-resistant when they are subconsciously resistant. This would be similar to how people often insist that they will no longer commit some wrong. For example, they're not going to lie anymore or mistreat their spouse or break the speed limit only to commit it later. Moreover, a person, perhaps one who stands to gain something from the advance of the hiddenness argument, can be deeply resistant toward the idea that God, or toward the idea of God, and thus claim to be a non-resistant seeker in order to give the impression that the hiddenness argument is a good argument. Furthermore, as Clay Jones points out, quote, the Lord gives enough evidence of His existence to those who want to believe and will have their beliefs justified, but not so much evidence that those who don't want to believe will be forced to feign loyalty, end quote. Jones appeals to Matthew 12:39, in which Jesus says that an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Here, Jesus alludes to His resurrection as the only sign that will be given, and He implies that those who demand more evidence are wicked. Nevertheless, for the sake of argument, we will grant that there are some non-resistant non-believers. We're going to grant that premise. So if that's the case, it seems to follow then that the premises of the hidden, because of the premises of the hiddenness argument, that God does not exist. Although Schellenberg has more to say and clarify about the argument, we have described its crux. And as Schellenberg admits, it is, quote, really a fairly simple and straightforward argument, end quote. Well, let's now offer what you've all been waiting for, the Molinist response. The hiddenness argument faces various objections. See Inman 2018, Jordan 2017, Ray 2015. For example, from a Molinist perspective, Michael Thune, I think that's how you say his name, in 2006, argues that God will not provide some non-believer S with sufficient evidence for belief in God if God knows S will not freely choose to enter into a self-denying or a self-emptying kind of relationship with God upon receiving the evidence. However, although we agree, Thune does not consider that the conversion of a non-believer may have numerous, enormous ramifications or ripple effects that extend far into the future. On the other hand, Jason Marsh, 2008, offers a Molinist response to the following objection. Probably, God would not allow there to be an uneven distribution of theistic belief globally. Well, in response, Marsh argues that God sequesters non-believers or groups them together because He knows, via His middle knowledge, that their lack of opportunity to believe would will keep them from developing negative affections toward God. God's decision for remaining at an epistemic distance, then, is to keep these individuals innocent for a later time when they will be in a position to truly love God. But Marsh's argument is terse and focuses solely on the problem about the disproportionate spread of believers. We, therefore, offer a Molinist response to the Hiddenness argument that focuses on the broader picture surrounding a person's conversion. We are presupposing the soundness of Molinism as a theological position. Again, I've argued for it elsewhere. And we will argue that Molinism undercuts the Hiddenness argument. So our response is as follows. The above description of the Hiddenness argument makes it clear that it depends on the following principle. Let's call this principle A. Principle A. Necessarily, if God exists, then for some time t, and some finite person S, who is a non-resistant seeker at time t, God will ensure that or provide sufficient evidence for belief in God such that at t, S believes God exists. S will become a theist. Principle A is the heart of the Hiddenness argument, and it's a succinct summary of Schellenberg's defense of premise 1. Thus, if principle A is false, then premise 1 is false, and the argument is unsound. Now, Molinism undercuts principle A. Why? Since God knows both, 1, what a person would freely do in any circumstances they may find themselves in, and 2, the repercussions of the person's free actions, there are feasible scenarios in which God knows it's better that a non-resistant seeker does not become a believer immediately or indeed at all. Let me add a footnote. Following Schellenberg, by believer, we do not necessarily mean a Christian or a saved believer, but simply a finite person who believes that God exists. Nevertheless, we should note that according to Christianity, simply being a mere believer does not guarantee being saved or being in an eternal love relationship with God. See James 2:19, where the demons believe and shudder. So, in other words, given God's middle knowledge, it is possible that God will not ensure or provide sufficient evidence for belief in God such that certain non-resistant seekers become believers. Now, although there are many such possible feasible scenarios, Erasmus and I will discuss 2, only to illustrate the point. Scenario 1. Becoming a believer at a later time may benefit both the non-resistant seeker and others. So consider the possibility that God does not ensure that some non-resistant seeker S becomes a believer at some time t, the time that S becomes a non-resistant seeker, because he knows that 1, S will become a believer at some later time, call it t star, and 2, that it would be better that S becomes a believer at t star than at t. So for example, suppose that Jones becomes a non-resistant seeker at time t. And suppose further that the following 2 propositions are true and that God, via his middle knowledge, knows them. 1, if Jones becomes a believer at t, then Jones would get married in France, his home country, remain in France his entire life, and lead no one to faith in God. 2, if Jones does not become a believer at t, then Jones would move to Africa, become a believer in Africa at time t star, a year later than t, get married in Africa, start a Christian school in Africa, have tremendous positive impact on the lives of the many students in his school, and lead 305 people to faith in God, which otherwise would have not been the case. It's clear that in the above scenario, it would be better that Jones does not become a believer at t. Indeed, it would be unloving and unwise for God to ensure that Jones becomes a believer at t, and hence a perfectly wise and loving God would not do this. Now let me add a footnote here to support this claim with a little bit of anecdotal evidence. If anyone today seems to be a non-resistant non-believer, it would be Jordan Peterson. I spent much of my time communicating the gospel to my friend Alex. This is a true story. Who aggressively resisted my attempts to evangelize him. He would not listen to me or read any book written by a Christian. I tried to give him William Lane Craig and Mike Licona to read their stuff, and he would not accept them because they were writing from a Christian position. He would just reject them. So I eventually gave up and wiped the dust off my feet. A year later, I ran into him, and he told me with a smile on his face, "Tim, I'm a Christian now." I was shocked and overjoyed, and I asked Alex, "How did this happen?" And he responded by saying, "Well, I read Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life." And I responded by saying, "But Jordan Peterson is not a Christian. That's not a Christian book." And Alex replied, "I know, but he got me so close to the cross that everything you said in the past now made perfect sense." So it seems that Jordan Peterson is the gateway drug to Christianity. Alex then told me that God knew that he had to be reached by someone who was not writing from a Christian perspective. Jordan Peterson was that guy. Thus, it is good that God allows Jordan Peterson, at least for a finite period of time, to remain in a state of non-resistant non-belief, at least for those like Alex. Scenario 2. After coming to belief in the existence of God, a person may rebel against God and in turn damage the faith of other believers. It's possible that a person loses their faith in God, rebels against God, and becomes a non-believer after having been a non-resistant seeker who became a mere believer, who became a theist. Now, many of us have witnessed such sad situations. And Schellenberg himself acknowledges that many doubters began while they were still believers and quite happy and also quite busy in their belief. So this does happen. In fact, Schellenberg claims that this was the case for him. And Joshua Harris, author of I Kissed Dating Goodbye, is a recent well-known example, a sad example. So unfortunately, this deconversion of a believer may have devastating effects on the faith of other believers, especially believers who admire or look up to the person deconverting. But this raises an important question. If God knows, for example, that if some non-resistant seeker S becomes a believer, then 1, S would eventually deny God's existence. 2, S would become even more bitter toward God than S was before becoming a believer. And 3, S's deconversion would cause other believers to doubt or leave the faith. Then why would or should God ensure that the non-resistant seeker becomes a mere believer? It seems obvious that in such a case, God, as being perfectly wise and loving, would not ensure that the non-resistant seeker becomes a mere believer. God knows that in the grand scheme of things, it would be better to not ensure that S becomes a believer. Thus, to protect certain other believers' relationships with God, God would not ensure that S becomes a believer, and this would not be unfair, but would be expected from a wise and loving God. However, there are cases in which believers leave the faith or renounce their belief in God and in turn damage the faith of other believers. Well, why does God allow this to happen? Why would God ensure that some non-resistant seeker becomes a believer if he knows that the seeker will eventually deconvert, apostatize, as Hebrews 5:11 through 6:20 warns against, and damage the faith of other believers? Does God not always try to protect the faith of his children? Well, in response, it's possible that in these cases, if the non-resistant seeker did not become a believer, more damage would have resulted than otherwise would have been the case, which God knows. For example, perhaps God knows that while a certain non-resistant person is a believer, they will lead many people to faith, and this good outweighs the minor damage done by the person's later deconversion. Thus, clearly, God has good or morally sufficient reasons for allowing such non-resistant seekers to become believers, even though he knows they will eventually apostatize. The salient point, then, is that in each individual situation regarding non-resistant seekers, God knows whether it would be better for the non-resistant seeker to become a believer. However, since there are feasible situations in which it would be better for God not to ensure that a non-resistant seeker becomes a believer, principle A is false. It is not the case that necessarily God will ensure that any non-resistant seeker believes that God exists. This in turn implies that the first premise of the hiddenness argument is false, and therefore the argument is unsound. Proponents of the hiddenness argument might object that it's highly implausible that God would have morally sufficient reasons for not ensuring that each and every non-resistant seeker becomes a believer immediately or at all. This objection has two problems. First, it presupposes that there are in the actual world numerous non-resistant seekers as opposed to merely a few. Second, even if there were many non-resistant seekers, why think God lacks morally sufficient reasons for not ensuring that they all become believers immediately, given chaos theory, or that seemingly small events can be significantly consequential, the frailty or sensitivity of human nature, and the thought experiments offered here, it is plausible that God would have good reasons for not ensuring this. For all we know, the actual world is the best feasible freedom-permitting world, even with all of its moral, natural, and gratuitous evils, as well as its degrees of divine hiddenness. For example, it is possible that the actual world is the one feasible freedom-permitting circumstance where evil is ultimately defeated and all who are not trans-world damned are saved. If this feasible maximal harvest world exists, then a perfectly wise and loving God would create it, no matter how much suffering, evil, or divine hiddenness existed. How much time do I have? All right, I have about 2 more pages I could give, but I'll stop it here to open it up for questions. So, thank you. Matt.
It seems like this could be stronger than just a Molinist solution, that anybody who believes in foreknowledge can use your Jordan Peterson example as a counterexample of the first premise. So what makes this particularly Molinist?
Well, I think it's because God knew what they would do before he created the world. So the simple foreknowledge guy just knows what will happen. So that just seems to be free knowledge. But God needs his middle knowledge to be able to know what, for the sovereignty. Simply know. So I like to say it like this. If I went into the future to see who wins the World Series in 2030 and then come back to 2021, how am I sovereign or provident over who wins the World Series in 2030? That's just something that will happen. But there's no providence or sovereignty here. And so what we need here is I'm trying to say, look, this is how God can be provident and sovereign over the entire thing. So I don't think simple foreknowledge gets you there, but I think middle knowledge does. So thank you. It's a good question. Yeah, Chris.
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this question, but I disagree with the premise that Schellenberg pushed forward that the divine hiddenness argument is the strongest argument. I think what's sticking in me is Romans 1:20, no one is without excuse.
Right.
And so is this difficult to argue because you have to step down and grant something that we are stating otherwise is not true? Like we're talking about Jordan Peterson, or if somebody is a non-resistant potential believer, I'm getting the phraseology wrong, but it still seems to me that they're resisting. If they don't believe, then they are resisting. You said like intellectual or emotional, right? Then they are resisting. Mm-hmm. How can this person exist? Is that what makes us have to go through such mental gymnastics to try to respond?
Well, if I'm following you, I mean, first of all, that's why I we gave reason to doubt that non-resistant non-believers exist. In fact, I know some people who advance this argument who tell me that they themselves are non-resistant non-believers and they go to church every Sunday and go through the motions. But then when I push back on them, they seem to get pretty emotional about it. So I at least doubt myself. I can't prove it, but God knows if they really are a non-resistant non-believer. So I doubt. There might be. Look, I think I think for us as Christians, we can just say, okay, I doubt the second premise. But most people, when I'm interacting regarding this argument, they're just assuming it, and they're like, "You really think that?" They say that the key premise is the first premise, and so that's why let's have some fun. Let's grant this one and go after what they think is the strong key premise. So, I don't know if does that answer your question?
It does. I mean, you said that you're granting that, but as a Christian, versus philosopher, trying to interact with the argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Bill.
You took the argument in a slightly different direction than I thought you were going to. And this other direction that I was thinking of makes me very uncomfortable, but I'd like to hear your reaction to it.
All right.
Take the Jordan Peterson case, where through his unbelief, thousands, millions come to know Christ and find eternal life, but he never does. Mm-hmm. Even though if God had just given him a little more evidence, then he would have believed and been saved himself. That seems so utilitarian, you know. I could see, a world in which one guy is lost, but so many others are saved is a much better world. And yet, what about poor Jordan Peterson? I think a person could say on your behalf, or on the Molinist behalf, well, God gives Jordan Peterson sufficient evidence for salvation. Mm-hmm. It's not as though God isn't loving toward him. He could give Jordan Peterson maybe far greater measures of evidence and grace, but he doesn't respond to them. So it's not as though God sort of abandoned him, but still it makes me feel uncomfortable.
I think we can answer that because I think on this one, with the Jordan Peterson case, I said at least for a time, God would allow him. So on Schellenberg's case, he says God will never allow there to be. There's no time where God will allow there to be a non-resistant non-believer. And so we're saying, okay, God knows that if he allows Jordan Peterson to be a non-resistant non-believer up until 2022, then X number of people get saved that would otherwise not be saved, and then God gives Jordan Peterson what he needs. Now, if Jordan Peterson is a trans-world damned kind of person who would not believe no matter what, which I don't think he is. I'm hoping that Jordan Peterson comes to Christ. But let's just suppose that God knows that no matter what he does for Jordan Peterson, he would always reject him. Then he doesn't have to reveal himself, I don't think.
So I was thinking of the case where Jordan Peterson would become.
Yeah, I kind of think if
God just kind of withholds the evidence.
I don't think God does that. I think if there's anybody that would become a Christian, then God will make sure they get what they need. Now, maybe that's controversial.
Even if it has all these deleterious consequences, of other people not coming to Christ.
Well, okay, so the last thing I said here, let's think about this. Is it even possible, Kirk and I were talking about this a couple nights ago, is it even possible that this actual world is the one world out of all the feasible worlds God could create? If it's even possible that the actual world is the one feasible, freedom-permitting circumstance where evil is ultimately defeated and all who are not trans-world damned are saved, if this feasible maximal harvest world exists, then I say God would either refrain from creation or create this world. no matter how much pain, evil, and suffering or degrees of divine hiddenness are in it.
And your thesis needn't be so radical. There could be a range of feasible worlds
Well,
in that top
there could be.
tier
Yeah,
with
so-
different people in it.
Right. Well, Kirk and I have talked about the tied for the best possible worlds. And I don't think it makes sense to say there's a best possible world, because you can always add one more pepperoni to the pizza, one more palm tree to the island that you've talked about before. But I think there could be a best of all feasible worlds. Now, there could be also tied for the best feasible worlds, but it's possible that there's one best of all feasible freedom-permitting circumstances. And so if there is that one, I mean, we can't prove it, but God would be in a position to know.
Again, though, I just want to emphasize, you don't need to take such a radical stance. There doesn't need to be one best feasible world. There could be a range
could be.
of them all in
Right.
the top tier.
Yes, that's
that are
true.
comparable. And
I
so
agree.
you could still have an indefinite number of choices.
Yeah, I would agree. Is there a, am I missing something? Oh, okay, go. I mean, I'm getting nervous if Bill Craig is pushing on me here. So that's like the scariest. No. Yes.
Because Dr. Craig's point would still preserve certain degrees of divine freedom within those constraints. I think there's value.
I hear you. I agree, and I think the more choice. I like seeing the most or more choices available for God. But even on mine, on this more radical view, if there is only one best of all feasible worlds, God still has libertarian freedom to refrain from creation or to create. And so it's still, he doesn't lose libertarian freedom there. Chris?
I don't have a second, somebody has one.
Oh, yeah, Ben.
It seemed like your argument really depends on time, the passage of time. So I was wondering, as a devil's advocate, if you suggested that at the end of the world, when the narrow gate closes all at once for everybody, God, in order for this to work all the way through, God would have to find a point in time where there were no non-resistant non-believers in the Jordan Peterson sense, right? Because then after the end of the world, there would be no further passage of time to justify that.
So that's a good point. On the Molinist view, it's not like he has to go find it. He simply knows. And so he knows if this is that one feasible world, or at least one of the tied for the best feasible world. So he simply knows. So I like to, as you probably know, I mean, I like to compare this to the Avengers movies, Infinity War and Endgame. And Doctor Strange, by the way, the guy who developed Doctor Strange's character is a graduate from Biola or Talbot with a philosophy and theology degree, Scott Derrickson. And he gave Doctor Strange the superpower of Molinism. And he used middle knowledge to save. I mean, Dr. Craig, I think that you actually inspired the Avengers movies. He's running, he doesn't want that. But I think you really did, indirectly anyway, have such a huge impact on these movies that have had such an impact on culture, because Doctor Strange seriously has middle knowledge, and he used middle knowledge to save the whole Marvel Comics universe. And my point is, Doctor Strange knew of all the possible futures that he could actualize, saw the one where evil was defeated and all the saints were raised, and he picked that one, knowing there was a lot of evil and suffering and affliction that was going to happen, but it was still the best feasible world. So, yeah.
I don't know, I just think some people would think it's implausible that there would be any point in time where there were no non-resistant non-believers.
Implausible is not impossible. And so that's also with those movies, they're like, how many, Doctor Strange surveyed, 14,605 possible worlds. And they're like, how many do we win? And he's like, only one. And they're like, 1 out of 14,605, those are horrible odds. But that's not the point. He had one. So, yeah. Chris.
I just wanted to piggyback on what Dr. Craig said. If you're familiar with Jordan Peterson speaking, Jordan Peterson seems, I think the reason he seems to be what you were saying, a non-resistant non-believer, is not because it's in opposition to Romans 1:20. I don't believe that Jordan Peterson doesn't believe in God because there's not evidence for God. Rather, I think that Jordan Peterson has stated he doesn't believe in God because of who he is.
That could be.
But
I don't want to psychoanalyze Jordan right
well,
now.
I don't want to do that
Doesn't
either.
everyone else?
But that makes a big difference in utilitarianism. If Dr. Craig was saying it's not that God is hiding something from him to the last moment to then present it and say, and now you see the fullness of me, you can believe. Rather, God has said, I am here, and what Jordan Peterson may be working through is the devils that are holding him back from feeling like he's worthy of that. And that
could be.
That allows both your monistic perspective of somebody being a legitimate, non-resistant person, and 120 to both work out, and in the course of time, maybe his heart will soften.
Yeah, I hope so. Eric.
Yeah, kind of what we were talking about yesterday, and I think I've kind of maybe even add to that of one possibility, which I think you maybe even implied or touched on, would be if we assume apostasy is possible, then if God would know if he revealed himself to someone and they came to salvific knowledge, but then apostatized, and if we take into consideration it's better that they had not had ever known to begin with, then it then becomes a sign of God's mercy and grace to hide himself from them, so that they would not incur more judgment given that they had more revelation.
I agree. That would be a form of grace, wouldn't it?
That's the official time, but if you want, so you can either cut this off.
I'll keep talking if anybody wants to. Yeah, feel free to leave, but I'll stick around for a while. Oh, yeah, Bill.
Aren't there some hidden assumptions behind premise one that need to be surfaced? I haven't read the book, so you can tell me if he does surface these. But it seems to me that this argument could be just as much an argument for universalism as for atheism. Why couldn't you just say that God saves everyone, that universalism is true, and so he doesn't need to overcome the unbelief of non-resistant non-believers because it's irrelevant.
Very astute, Bill. No. Yeah, you're exactly right. And in the paper that's actually going to be published in the journal, we do talk about this. And we're like, the inclusivist or the universalist isn't affected by this. But since the vast majority of Christians are going to say that hell exists, either in eternal conscious torment or annihilationism, then you have problems there that you have to work through. I don't remember him talking about that in there. He may have. But it is something that we've fleshed out in our response. So, yes.
I have a very good friend who is a Schellenberg fan and says he is a non-resistant, non-believer. And I want to be able to say something to him, but I don't think any of these lines really help me to say that, well, you will become a Christian in the future. Seems presumptuous to say that at least you're not going to apostatize, so that's...
And I didn't say he would be. He could be.
But I'm still not sure how to frame this, what to say to this person.
So, yeah, you're looking for the pastoral kind of response. That's good. I have to think about that. As a former pastor, I need to put my youth pastor hat back on sometimes. But I guess I would just start, let's just think through this logically. And I'd give him my paper and let him see what he would reject. So I'm given a logical argument, and if he thinks that this is a good logical argument against the existence of God, this is a defeater that undercuts it. And so his argument is not sound anymore. And so he can't use hiddenness as a reason for atheism anymore. He has to find a different reason.
And then give him a copy of 12 Rules for Life.
Give him the copy of 12 Rules for Life. That's good. Yeah, Arthur.
I think you're being really gracious, by the way. I think because it doesn't apply to Christianity, considering that everyone is resistant. Right? There's no one righteous, not even one. And so I'm sort of like stuck on that in the sense that it's like, well, we're not these machines, I guess, where we just judge everything based on the information given to us, and then we pop out beliefs about God. Rather, it's the relational aspect of stuff that's going to come in there. God wants a relationship with us, not just believe in propositions that He exists. I know what you're saying with paper, and you're being gracious in the paper. But even to that question, like I would say, no, everyone's resisting.
I don't think this argument is one that should keep Christians up at night. but it's one that is providing justification for atheists, or at least they think it is. And so we need to take that from them if we love them, right? And so that's what I'm trying to do there. And I also think, Bill just gave a paper, and we had a short exchange afterwards, and talking about a guy that I felt like was a non-resistant non-believer. In fact, Adam here, Adam Johnson, has gone through a phase like this where he felt like he didn't have 50% certainty. So in that sense, you could say these folks did not believe that God existed. But both Adam and my friend, back from the Reasonable Faith group in Kearney, Nebraska, they both thought it was the inference to the best explanation, even though they didn't think it was 50%. They didn't have 50% or above certainty that God exists. They still thought it was the best explanation, and especially when you compare it to Pascal's wager, then I'm going to put my faith in this. And they lived that way for a while, and for some people it might take longer than others. So if anybody really is a non-resistant non-believer, I tell them, look, this still is the best explanation, and give them a version of Pascal's wager then or something like that, and they say, I encourage you to live this way. Both Adam and my friend Zach did that, and obviously Adam is way past 50% now, and just a little bit now, he says, and so is my friend Zach back home. And so now I do know somebody who is a strong advocate of the Hiddenness argument, and he has, he can gain from the advance of the Hiddenness argument. He tells me that he is trying to live it, like Adam was, but I'm not the judge. I don't have middle knowledge. I don't know for sure, but it seems to me, sometimes I don't know if you really are a non-resistant non-believer like Adam was, or my friend Zach. So anyway, I do encourage people to put their faith in it, even if they don't. Live that way for a while, and I think and Bill, you can let me know what you think. I think over time, when you do start to experience the Holy Spirit then when you open yourself up to the Holy Spirit. So I think if God knows you would receive Christ and receive the Holy Spirit, if you don't reject it, then he will get it to you when he knows it's the perfect time for you to have it. So I don't know. It's related to your talk that you gave. So.
Closely connected, really.
Yeah, which was a pleasant surprise.
That was a good answer to my question.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
I got like a situation in which it's the opposite of that. So there's a guy in the ministry for 4 years. He was an atheist when he started. Believes in the resurrection, believes God exists,
Wow.
doesn't want to follow Jesus.
And he calls himself an atheist?
No, he doesn't.
Oh,
what
okay.
I'm saying is he doesn't want to follow Jesus because it's not the evidence that's the issue here.
Yeah, that's
He's
the
just
thing.
like, I know what Christianity implies, and I don't want that. But if you tell him you believe Jesus resurrected from the dead, he'll be like, yes,
Yeah.
all the evidence leads that way.
Demons believe and shudder, and so does this guy. Right, yeah. So, hey, I will be sticking around here for a while, but I want to let you guys go. Thank you so much for coming and hanging out.